Montana Territory, August 1879. The baby would not stop crying, and the lawmen were only a day behind her. Odessa Kline gripped the reins tighter, her fingers raw from heat and dust. Her worn boots hung loose in the stirrups of the borrowed mule, her skirts stiff with sweat. Little Olive, barely 6 months old, fussed in the sling against her chest, her tiny voice scratchy from days without real rest. The sun had begun to dip low, casting long shadows across the canyon trail, and Odessa's heart pounded louder with each hoofbeat. She had not meant for any of this to happen, not the fire, not the marshal's injury, not the baby in her arms who was not hers by blood, but hers all the same. A hawk cried overhead. Odessa ducked her head, kept riding. She saw the ranch before she saw the man. A wide stretch of open land, fenced with raw-cut pine and scattered with grazing cattle. A single barn stood to the east, and a modest 2-story cabin near it, shuttered tight. She was halfway to the fence line when her mule let out a snort and stopped. That was when she saw him. He stepped out from behind the barn, slow but steady. Tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a worn trail coat that looked like it had seen a dozen winters. His hair was too long to be neat, and his eyes were sharp under the brim of a dusty hat. He held no rifle, but Odessa saw the revolver at his hip. She froze. He did not. "You lost," he called, voice rough like gravel but not unkind. Odessa swallowed, her throat dry. "Just passing through." He looked at her, then at the bundle pressed against her, then back again. "Does not look like passing through." "Looks like running." She hesitated, her heart slamming against her ribs. The baby whimpered. The man stepped closer slowly. "You got a name?" "Odessa," she said. "Kline," he nodded once. "I am Jonah Zeller. This is my land." She waited for him to tell her to leave. For him to ask why she was out here alone, why the baby did not look like her, why her dress was torn and her boots caked with days of trail dust. Instead, he said, "That child needs water. You both do." She blinked, stunned. He turned and started walking toward the cabin. "Well, you coming or not?" Odessa hesitated for only a moment before nudging the mule forward. Inside the cabin, the air was cool and smelled of cedar. He brought her a basin and a cloth and poured a mug of water with a steady hand. She drank slow, trying not to cry from the relief. Olive settled, soothed by the stillness. Jonah leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "You want to tell me why you are really out here?" "No," she said quietly, "but I will not lie to you." He studied her a long moment, then nodded. "Fair enough." Odessa looked around. The cabin was simple wooden table, 2 chairs, a shelf of books, a rifle mounted above the hearth. It was a man's home, not a family's. "Are you alone?" she asked. "Been that way a while." She adjusted the sling around Olive carefully. "I did not steal her, if that is what you are wondering." "I am not," he said, and meant it. She looked at him then. Really looked. He was not young, but not old either. Maybe in his 30s, with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much. He looked like a man who had learned to keep his heart quiet. She felt a strange twist in her chest. "I need a place," she said, "just for a few days, until it is safe." Jonah nodded once. "You are safe as long as you are with me." The words caught her off guard. She blinked, stunned by the sudden warmth in her throat. "Why?" she asked. He shrugged. "You got a baby in your arms and no one else around. That is reason enough." There was silence. The kind that settled heavy but not unkindly. Jonah moved to the stove. "You eat rabbit stew?" She nodded. "If it is warm," he cracked a faint smile. "It is." They ate in silence, the kind that was not awkward, just quiet. Olive slept, finally, her fist curled near her mouth. Odessa kept glancing at Jonah, not sure what to make of the way his hands moved carefully, like he was afraid of breaking something. He did not ask more questions. He did not pry. When the sun dipped below the hills, Jonah cleared his throat. "I sleep in the barn when I have company," he said. "You take the bed, door locks from the inside." She stared at him. "You do not even know me." "Do not need to. I seen enough to know when someone is running from something bad. I will not be part of it catching you." She looked down at Olive, then back at him. "Thank you," he nodded once. "You holler if you need anything." He stepped outside, closing the door behind him. Odessa stood there for a moment, stunned. Then she walked to the bed, laid Olive down, and stared at the ceiling. Her heart beat slower now, calmer. She had been running so long she had forgotten what it felt like to breathe. Outside, the wind shifted. The moon rose, and for the first time in weeks, Odessa slept. The next 3 days passed in borrowed quiet. Odessa helped around the ranch where she could, mending a torn fence line, sweeping the porch, heating water for coffee. Jonah never pushed, never questioned. He just worked beside her, quiet and steady like the land itself. Sometimes she caught him watching her, not with suspicion. With something else, something softer. She found herself watching him too. He moved like a man who had carried too much weight for too long and was still standing. There was something in that made her chest ache. On the 4th morning, the sound of hoofbeats broke the peace. Jonah stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand. Odessa scooped Olive into her arms, heart pounding. 3 riders appeared at the edge of the property. Dusty, armed, one of them wore a badge. Jonah glanced back. Inside, now, she obeyed, ducking behind the doorway. Her breath came fast. She heard Jonah's voice, calm and hard. "This is private land." "We are looking for a woman," the marshal said. "Tall, brown hair, carrying a baby that is not hers." Odessa's throat closed. Jonah did not hesitate. "Ain't no woman here but my wife, had a baby 6 months back." "You saying I do not know my own child?" Silence. The marshal shifted. "You married?" "I am," Jonah lied smoothly. "And I do not take kindly to strangers coming on my land calling my wife a thief." Another pause, then hooves turned. The men rode off. Odessa stepped outside, stunned. He looked at her. "You all right? You lied for me." He nodded. "You needed me too." Her voice cracked. "Why?" He looked at her, steady. "Because you and that baby deserve better than being hunted for trying to protect someone." She stared at him. Then she whispered, "That night when I set the fire, I did it to distract the man who was hurting her." Jonah nodded. "I figured." She looked down, throat thick. "I do not regret it." "Good," he said, "because I would have done the same." She looked up at him then, really looked. And something in her heart shifted. He saw it too. Neither of them spoke. But they did not need to. The wind moved through the grass around them, soft and warm. And for the first time, Odessa thought maybe she had not just found shelter, maybe she had found home. The hens had scattered again. Jonah crouched at the edge of the coop, coaxing them back with a low whistle and a tin of feed. A few pecked warily at the dirt, their feathers ruffled from a fox's midnight visit. The latch had held, but barely. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open. Odessa stepped out, her shawl drawn close, Olive resting against her hip. The baby's eyes were heavy-lidded, her small fists tucked against her mother's ribs. Odessa's hair, once pinned and tight, now fell loose around her shoulders, thick with dust and wind from the hills. "You're not a farmer," she said. Jonah glanced up at her. "No, but you keep trying like one." He wiped his hands on his trousers. "Everything worth doing's a mess at first." She studied him a moment, then came closer, careful not to startle the chickens. "I can help mend that fence behind the shed. Looks like something's been pushing at the bottom rail." "Found fresh prints out there yesterday," he said. "Small, coyote maybe. I've got a good hand with wire." He did not argue, just nodded and stood. They worked through the late morning, side by side beneath a sky streaked silver blue. Odessa held the spool while Jonah pulled tension, his fingers nicked from old cuts. She didn't ask what kind of work he'd done before this life. She could already guess enough of it from his shoulders, from the way he listened more than he spoke. A wind picked up across the field and Olive stirred in her blanket, tied snug to Odessa's back. She hummed something low, tuneless, and the baby quieted. "You raise her by yourself before this?" Jonah asked, voice low. "She isn't mine," Odessa said, "but you've been the one keeping her fed, carried her through the hills." "There wasn't anyone else who would." He tightened the last twist of wire. "She cries less now. She knows she's not in danger." He leaned his weight on the post, testing it. "You ever think about keeping still?" She looked at him, surprised. "You mean staying?" "I mean breathing easy, letting your hands rest." Her jaw flexed. "That's a hard thing to do when you've got men with guns remembering your name." Jonah didn't press it. He never did. Instead, he stood and brushed off his palms. "Lunch'll be cold if we don't get in soon." They sat at the table with the windows open. The breeze brought in the smell of wild sage. Odessa spooned porridge into Olive's mouth while Jonah sliced the last of the smoked trout he'd caught the week before. They ate quietly, but not uncomfortably. It was the kind of silence that came from people learning how to share space again. I heard you talking in your sleep last night, Jonah said without lifting his eyes. Odessa's hand stilled. You said a name, Marshall Deke. Her fingers curled around the spoon. He's the one who let her get hurt, then blamed me for stopping him. Jonah nodded slowly. That's the man who rode up here. She looked up. You knew, figured it when he didn't give his name. Why didn't you say something? Didn't see the point in stirring up what was already settled. She stared at him. You think it's settled, you're here. He's not. That won't last. He folded his arms on the table. I've seen men like him. They don't go looking too hard unless there's money in it. If she wasn't born to someone rich or useful, he'll move on soon enough. She's the daughter of a saloon girl who got herself in trouble with the wrong man. Jonah's brow creased. That man being Deke, she begged me to take her, said she'd do anything if I got Olive out. I set fire to the back room, got her clear, but she died from the burns. He didn't say anything, just reached for his cup. I didn't know what else to do, she added, voice thin. You did more than most would have. That silence came again, thick with things not said. Later, while Olive napped in a crate lined with wool, Jonah brought out a battered fiddle. He didn't ask if Odessa wanted music. He just played. The sound was raw, not polished, but steady. Like the man himself. Odessa sat on the porch, her knees drawn up beneath her. She watched the hills, not the road. You ever been married? She asked. No, why not? He set the bow aside. Spent too long riding with men who only knew how to break things. Couldn't carry a life like this back then. And now he met her gaze. Now I know better. She looked away, the corners of her mouth twitching at something close to a smile. I was engaged once, she said. In Kansas. He worked in a feed store, said he wanted to build a house with a porch and a pear tree. What happened? He died. Fever took half the town in 2 weeks. Jonah didn't speak. Just let the wind fill the quiet. She turned to him. You're the first man I've met in a long time who doesn't try to take something. Jonah stood, dusted off his pants, and looked out toward the far ridge. Everything worth having comes slow, he said, and you don't take what isn't offered. The sun dipped low, casting long bands of gold across the hills. The chickens settled in. The mule wandered toward the trough. Olive stirred, let out a soft cry, then went still again. Odessa looked at Jonah's back, the way he stood with one hand resting on the porch post, like he was rooted there. She didn't speak again. But that night, when she locked the door, she didn't slide the chair beneath the knob. And in the dark, with Olive breathing soft beside her, she let her hand rest on the bed's quilted edge where a second pillow now lay. The first frost came quiet. Jonah stepped outside before dawn, boots crunching over the stiffened grass, the air sharp in his lungs. A thin skin of ice clung to the water trough. The sun hadn't crested the ridge yet, but the sky was paling, windless and still. He checked the barn doors, ran a hand along the mule's flank, then glanced toward the cabin. Inside, Odessa stirred the fire back to life with slow, practiced motions. Olive, bundled in a wool wrap, slept in the cradle Jonah had built from leftover pine boards and a pillowcase. Odessa hadn't said anything about it, but she touched the carved edge more than once. When Jonah came in, he shrugged off his coat and set a small bundle on the table. Found a rabbit caught in the snare behind the creek, he said. Meat'll hold better now that the cold's come. She unwrapped the cloth and ran her thumb along its fur. You want me to clean it? I can do it. No, she said, pulling the apron over her dress. You already hauled it in. Jonah leaned against the doorframe while she worked the knife. She moved with focus, hands sure and quiet, the way she did everything. He'd noticed that about her, that she never rushed, never wasted motion. Even when she was scared, she was steady. It made him think of the old cottonwoods along the draw, the way they bent in wind but never broke. He nodded toward the cradle. She's heavier than she was. She's eating better. He watched her fingers, stained with red. You've done more for her than most would. Odessa set the blade down and wiped her hands. I didn't come here to be praised. I'm not, he said, just noticing. She looked up at him, her face unreadable, then her eyes dropped to the rabbit again. After they'd eaten, Odessa stepped out to the ridge with the laundry basket. The sheets flapped in the wind, stiff with damp. Jonah joined her, carrying a length of rope and 2 stakes. I figured we'd start a new line, he said. Wind's better up here. She helped him drive the stakes. They didn't speak much. but the silence between them had changed. It didn't feel like distance anymore, more like something waiting to settle. When the last clothespin was clipped, Odessa brushed her hands down her skirt and looked out toward the valley. "You ever think about leaving here?" she asked. Jonah's jaw shifted. "Not lately. You don't miss anything. There are things I remember. Doesn't mean I want to go chasing them again." She nodded once. "I used to think I'd end up in a city. St. Louis, maybe. Teach letters to girls who didn't know how to hold a pencil." "You still could," she gave a dry laugh. "With what name, what past?" Jonah didn't answer. He picked up the empty basket. Odessa followed him down the slope, her boots catching on loose shale. That evening, after Olive had drifted off, Odessa stood at the stove, drying her hands. She turned as Jonah set a small box on the table. "What's that?" He opened it. Inside, nestled in a square of flannel, lay a tin brooch shaped like a swallow. "Found it at a trading post near Fort Benton last winter," he said. "Didn't know why I bought it then." She stared at it, then at him. "I don't want charity." "It's not charity, it's a thank you." "For what?" "For trusting me." His voice was low. "For staying." Odessa's fingers hovered over the brooch. "I haven't decided anything yet. I know." She picked it up, turned it over. "Swallows always come back. That's what my mother used to say." She was right. She set it down carefully. "You ever been in love?" "I thought I was once." "What happened?" "She loved someone else. I didn't fight for her." Odessa's gaze lingered on him. "Why not?" "I wasn't the right man then." And now he met her eyes. "Now I don't want to miss something that could last." The room was quiet except for the low crackle of the fire. Odessa stepped closer. Her hand brushed the brooch again, then dropped to her side. "I don't know how to be safe with someone." "Not really. You don't have to know everything right away," he said. "You just have to want to try." She looked down, then back up. "I do." Jonah moved carefully, like she might still bolt, but she didn't. When his hand touched hers, she didn't pull away. Later, long after the lamp had been turned low, Olive stirred once and fell still again. Odessa lay beside Jonah, her head tucked beneath his chin, his arm across her waist like it had always belonged there. Outside, the frost deepened. The wind picked up and rattled the porch rail. But inside the cabin, there was warmth, and for the first time in years, Odessa was not afraid of the morning. Snow came late that year, but when it came heavy. By the first week of December, the trails beyond the ridge had vanished beneath drifts deep enough to swallow wagon wheels. Jonah kept the barn warm with cedar he'd split back in October, and Odessa took to boiling root vegetables half the day just to keep the air moist enough for Olive's breath to stay smooth. One evening, after the lamps were lit and the floor swept clean, she found Jonah at the table, sleeves rolled back, mending the leather strap of his saddlebag. "You planning to ride out?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Not far, just down to the bluff. One of the steers didn't come in last night. Might be caught up in that broken gully." Odessa leaned against the doorframe. "You weren't going to say anything?" "You've had enough on your shoulders today. Thought I'd let you sit still for once." She crossed her arms. "You can stop deciding what's too much for me." Jonah set the all down slow. "I'm not trying to coddle you." "Then speak plain." He finally looked at her. "I don't like the idea of you watching the door every time I step out." "I'd rather not give you more reason to worry." Odessa's jaw eased, but only slightly. "You're not the only one who knows how to keep watch." "I don't doubt that," he said. "But I've lived through enough winters to know when a man's better off not riding alone." She stepped toward the table and picked up the strap. "Then I'll come." He didn't argue, just handed her the tool and watched as she tightened the stitch. They left before dawn the next morning, Olive wrapped snug on Odessa's back beneath layers of wool and cotton. The mule carried the child's weight steady, while Jonah rode ahead, coat cinched tight, rifle slung across his saddle horn. They didn't speak much, words felt too brittle in the cold, but their glances carried enough. Past the frozen stream and over the low rise, they found the steer half buried in brush, its hind leg caught in a tangle of broken willow. Jonah moved first, voice low to keep the animal calm, while Odessa dismounted and kept Olive turned away from the wind. "You see the hoof?" he asked. She crouched beside him, brushing snow aside. "Twisted in the wrong direction, might be broken." He nodded. "We'll have to put him down." Odessa stood slowly. You want me to take Olive back? No, I want you to stay. Jonah drew the knife from his belt and stepped forward. The snow muffled nearly everything, but Odessa still heard the soft thud as the animal collapsed. He stayed beside it a moment, hand resting on its flank until the breath left it entirely. Later, as they rode back, Jonah said, You ever work stock before? My uncle had a few head. I helped when I was 12. Knew how to spot sickness before most of the men did. Figures. Odessa watched the path ahead, tight with ice. I used to think I'd make something of that, maybe run my own herd someday. You still could. She didn't answer, but her shoulders eased just enough to see it. Back at the cabin, after Jonah had salted the meat and hung the hide, they sat at the hearth with Olive nestled between them. The child had begun to babble in soft, broken syllables, her fingers always busy, tugging at buttons and curls alike. Sometimes I forget she didn't come from me, Odessa said, voice low. Jonah reached over and lifted one of Olive's hands. Doesn't matter much, I know. They sat like that for a long while, the fire crackling low, the wind pressing soft against the shutters. Then Jonah said, I've been thinking about the land east of the creek. Long as we can clear the brush come spring, it'd carry a good vegetable patch. Odessa turned toward him. You're planning ahead, I am, for both of us. He looked at her, not blinking. If you'll stay. She folded Olive's blanket tighter and leaned in so their shoulders touched. I already have. Outside, the wind picked up through the pines, but the cabin held. The fire warmed the corners of the room, and the child slept between them, her breathing steady and deep. It wasn't grand, it wasn't easy, but it was theirs. And that night they slept with their hands entwined beneath the quilt, the long dark finally giving way to something quiet and whole. The thaw came slow but sure, seeping into the land like a breath long held and finally released. By late March, the snow had pulled back from the creek, and the first shoots of green pushed up through the flattened grass. The roof still leaked in the back corner of the cabin, but the days grew longer, the wind warmer, and the silence between Jonah and Odessa had taken on a different shape, less guarded, more familiar, like the hush before a shared word. One morning, Jonah found Odessa kneeling in the soil east of the cabin, her sleeves rolled and fingernails dark with earth. Olive sat nearby on a blanket, chewing on a strip of dried apple, her blue bonnet sliding down over one eye. Jonah crouched beside them. You've already marked the rows. I've been thinking on it since December, she said, brushing her hair from her cheek. Carrots, turnips, a patch of sorrel near the edge, the ground's soft enough now. He eyed the tilled line. We could fence it with cedar slats. Keep the mule out. I was hoping you'd say that. He took the hoe from her hands and began working the next row. Odessa leaned back on her heels, watching him. The rhythm of his movements was slower than hers, but even. You were gone longer than usual yesterday, she said. There's a man who's been trapping along the West Ridge. Name's Harlan. Used to ride dispatch for the army. He's setting up a lean-to near the timberline. You think he's trouble? Jonah shook his head. Seems worn out, keeps to himself. He asked if we had any extra lye soap. Said he'd trade dried fish for it. Odessa dusted off her skirt. If he's lived through a winter up there, he's earned a bar or two. They worked in tandem until Olive began to fuss. Jonah lifted her into his arms, bouncing her gently as she pressed her face against his shoulder. She's cuttin' another tooth, he said, shifting her weight. She's been chewing on the edge of my coat whenever I hold her. Odessa tucked the blanket into her basket. I'll mash some oat and clove for her later. They walked back toward the cabin, Olive gumming at the collar of Jonah's shirt, the breeze warm enough now to leave the windows open. Inside, Jonah laid the child down while Odessa set water to boil. She moved slower lately, not from weariness, but from something quieter. Jonah had noticed it over the last few weeks, a stillness in her that hadn't been there before, like her body had decided it no longer had to prepare for flight. He sat across from her at the table. You ever think about making it official? She stirred the pot, not looking up. You asking? I am, she turned then, the ladle hanging from her fingers. You sure about that? Jonah's voice stayed steady. I've been sure since the day I watched you walk out of that barn with your chin high and your hands blistered from work that wasn't yours to do. Odessa lowered the ladle. You're not asking just because we share a roof and raise a child. I'm asking because I want to wake up beside you when we're both gray and worn, and I want to see her grow with your steadiness and your fire. I want you to carry my name if it gives you any shelter at all, and I want to carry yours if it gives you peace. Odessa crossed the room and sat beside him. I never thought I'd want anything like this again. You don't have to want it all at once, he said. Just enough to say yes. She took his hand. Yes. They wed in the clearing behind the barn 2 weeks later with the creek running fast and the wild plum trees just starting to bloom. Harlan came down from the ridge and stood beside Jonah, offering a tight nod and a flask as witness. Odessa wore a dress she'd resewn from an old church frock, its hem mended with a piece of Jonah's shirt. Afterward, they shared bread and dried berries beneath the open sky while Olive kicked her feet in the grass, her 2 new teeth catching the sun when she laughed. That night, Jonah carried his wife across the threshold, not out of ceremony, but because the floor still buckled near the doorway and she'd tripped on it once before. She laughed against his neck and he kissed her cheek, her temple, the line of her jaw. They lay curled together beneath the quilt, Olive breathing soft in her cradle, the stars visible through the open window. No words passed between them then. None were needed, years passed quiet and full. The garden grew strong under Odessa's hand, rows of green leaves and dark roots. Herbs hung from the rafters to dry. Jonah built a smokehouse beside the barn and traded salted meat for flour and lamp oil in town. Harlan kept to the ridge, visiting twice each winter, his beard longer each time, his stories harder to follow. Olive grew sturdy and loud, her laugh carrying over the fields. She learned to walk in bare feet and ride the mule by the time she was 5. She called Jonah Pa without ever being told to, and when she asked Odessa about the woman who gave her life, Odessa told her the truth, plain and gentle, and Olive nodded like she'd already known. In the evenings, they sat on the porch, Jonah's arm around Odessa's shoulders, Olive curled between them with a book or a piece of cloth to stitch. The land stretched wide before them, the hills soft with dusk, the world quiet and their own. They had no need for more. They had already built everything that mattered, and together they kept it, year after year, through spring rains and winter silence, through laughter and work, through every ordinary day made extraordinary by the simple fact of love that had been hard-earned and wholly kept. Nothing chased them anymore, they belonged.